So I'd like to introduce Commander Aaron McCrae, who's the Chief Operations Officer at Ignite Assurance Platform. As an accomplished leader, Commander McCrae brings over 28 years of experience in business and risk management operations. He has extensive expertise across multiple industry sectors, including healthcare, finance, manufacturing, defense, and federal government. He has guided companies in defining their organizational strategies, leading strategic initiatives, and improving overall operations and corporate risk practices. Commander McCrae serves as a commander in the United States Navy with nearly 25 years of experience executing strategic initiatives, organizational management, intelligence, research, and analysis. Recently joining Ignite, Jay Scott, the very talkative one down here, brings previous experience working with BPM and RPA environments, helping manufacturers adapt to the growing need for digital transformation. Jay's focus at Ignite Assurance Platform is now helping manufacturers with CMMC awareness and advisory. Please join me in welcoming Commander Aaron McCrae and Jay Scott as they present how the DoD's Cybersecurity Maturity Model, CMMC, will impact your business and how to prepare for the audit.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. It is really good to be here this morning. Can't believe 19 of these. Now, I haven't been to all of them, but I do remember the first 5, 6, or 7, or 8. In fact, a good coworker of mine that used to work with Dave Pappas, we used to come to these on a regular basis. So it's good to be back. I'm glad they're still doing this. What we want to do is if you wouldn't mind, just like there's a sheet of paper that Jay's going to pass around. If you want to write your name, if you want to participate, phone number, email, whatever, that we can contact you. We're giving away a Ring camera to anyone that's participated today, and we'd like to present that to you. So I'm going to have Jay pass that around. Before we get started, I do want to ask a few questions. How many are very, very familiar with CMMC? Okay. There's a smattering of you that know what this is, right? How many of you actually have to comply with CMMC? Okay. How many of you are part of the DIBCAC or working towards being, part of the Defense Industrial Base or working towards that? A few of you, right? Let me get kind of a showing of who's in the manufacturing space. Okay. A couple hands. Who's in the financial industry? All right. Healthcare. Okay. All right. Healthcare back there. Who's in like supporting government contract work? The majority is what I'm guessing, right? So this actually could apply to you. So I just wanted to just kind of get an understanding of who my audience is. Some of you are going, wait a minute, this guy's a commander and what's going on with this? I just got off of a deployment. I was deployed for 14 months doing technology refresh in the United States Navy as they're trying to modernize, because this is near and dear to them as well. It impacts the protection of their information. And I'm actually gratefully 3 months away from retirement for the Navy. So I'm kind of growing this out, and then all of a sudden the Russia-Ukraine conflict spun up, and then I got a notice I got to go back to duty. So this has got to come off this coming weekend. So anyways, we're presenting today on behalf of Ignite Platform, and it's a company that we work with. This is something that's near and dear to our hearts. We've been dealing with customers regarding CMMC when it first came out in version 1, and now in version 2, as the announcement came out in November of last year. So what we really want to do is make this as interactive as possible. I want you to ask questions. Raise your hand, stop me in the middle of speaking. This is for you, it's not for me, okay? I just want to be able to share with you what has happened, where did we come from, why do we have this, what are the changes that we can expect as we head into version 2.0, right? Because this rule has not been finalized yet. But we're part of what is the CMMC accreditation body. And so we sit in these meetings, as many of you probably do as well. And we listen to what's going on with the town halls. We listen to the CIO from the Department of Defense. And so we just had one maybe about 10 days ago. And so I have some updated information I can present to you. And that's really the intent and purpose today, is to share this information and help you address any concerns you might have. So please raise your hand if you have questions, okay? All right, so what we're going to cover today is a little bit about the health of the defense industrial base. Really interesting that the speaker this morning was talking about ransomware, and the very first thing he's dropping is the supply chain, right? And that's really at the heart of what CMMC is intended to do, as you'll find out, is to address the defense industrial base or the supply chain for the DoD. So we're going to start to break down CMMC, what is its intended purpose, the differences between some of the data types, and what the DoD is really focused on for CMMC, which is SCI and CUI. Don't worry, if you don't know what those are, we'll go through them. We'll give a little brief history of where it's come from, talk about practices versus maturity processes, which is what has changed from 1.0 to 2.0. So we'll focus a little bit on that as well. Then what I really want to do is get into some practical kind of conversations here. So if you're an organization that says, you know what, maybe we have to go through CMMC, or it's on our event radar, and I need to know about this, then we're going to talk about how do we scope appropriately. Anybody here have to deal with any other federal regulation, FedRAMP, FISMA? Raise your hand. So you know what I'm talking about when scoping becomes probably the largest effort you're going to do initially to figure out what your authorization boundary looks like. How do I apply this regulation and where to? So we're going to get into that. And then we're going to talk about audit preparation, because that's really what most people are concerned about. How do I get ready? What do I need to know? What do I need to do? How soon or how quickly do I need to do that? Jay is with me here this morning because our organization, Ignite, what we do is we help a lot of the defense industrial base, a lot of the manufacturing firms, a lot of government entities, not only with FedRAMP, but also with CMMC. We're actually working through to become a certified third-party assessment organization. We're really close to finishing that up. And we just finished our FedRAMP. So we're actually third-party assessment organization for FedRAMP. So this is near and dear to our heart. So we're going to share some experiences, lessons learned from the impacts to different businesses. So again, please, this is interactive. Absolutely, raise your hand if you got questions, want to know a little bit more. So let's kind of talk about, the health of the defense industrial base. One of the things that the DoD was concerned about, because they had, IG audits, the Inspector General went through and looked at their programs and said, hey, we've got some problems. You're sharing out information that might have national, security implications, right? It's very sensitive. While it might not be classified at a certain level, right, it might have fallen under what they used to call for official use only, or FOU, that type of data. It still had protection measures. You had to safeguard it. You couldn't just disclose it to just anyone. There had to have, a need to know, and it had to be for business purposes. Well, the problem is the DoD was doing this, and they're like, wait a minute, right? We've got all this money. We know we're building these things. We got these major prime contractors. You got your Raytheons, your Boeings, and so forth. And we're sending out all this technical information. And some of this is very, very specific to the warfighting community, right? If I'm building a tank, a plane, a ship, it doesn't matter. It's specifications. And so they were asking, how are you protecting this? How do you know that what these prime contractors are doing with this information meets our standards? And they didn't have an answer. There was no measurement. There were no metrics. There was no formal program. And then secondarily, they're like, do you know where this information is going beyond the prime contractor? No. So hence, fast forward, somewhere around 2011, they started to put together this concept of, let's put some basic type of controls in place, and then we'll have some derivatives coming from the NIST 853, which is what FISMA, FedRAMP, and other programs are based on, and we'll start pushing these controls out. The challenge with that is again, they had no idea how to measure it, how to hold people accountable, and there was nobody going out assessing any of these organizations. So what do you think these? What do you guys think? They ignored it. Absolutely ignored it. Next thing you know, and we kind of joked about this in the Navy, it's like, you're on a ship and you're doing an exercise out in the Pacific Rim, and you pass a Chinese vessel that's pretty similar to yours. How did that happen, right? Well, we all know how that happened. And so they said enough is enough. So we started making some changes, right? We started working through this. They wanted them to come up with a measurement. And so CMMC was born out of a collaborative effort to develop a set of controls. NIST 800-171 came about through a collaborative effort of, first of all, it was the DoD was involved, you had NIST involved, you had NARA involved, you had many organizations coming together to say we need to define a set of controls. NIST took the lead because 800-171 is actually a subset of controls from the 853, right? It's very specific. It's very tailored to the type of data, what they're calling controlled unclassified information. That's what the old FOUO has turned into. It's controlled unclassified information. That is the new term, if you're not familiar with it. And then they define, well, what are these categories? What does it apply to? And so we're going to kind of talk through that a little bit. But the thing
One
was,
thing you can touch on is that these things are not new at all. They've been around for quite a few years. And the DIB, when 2020, 2019, when these things came up, a lot of people thought, hey, where's this coming from? But they've been around for years, and the baseline is NIST 800-171.
for CMMC, yes, but it comes from the 853. So if you're familiar with that, then it won't be a surprise when you get to the 171. I recognize these access controls, right? These 14 families come from the 18 families. So they sent out a group that are called for some independent assessments of exactly how is the defense industrial base doing. And so the National Defense Industrial Association, or the NDIA, a little pointer here because I really want to show you what's on the next slide first, completed some assessments in 2019, 2020, and 2021, and basically it was over 8 areas that the DoD needed to make sure that they had controls in place, safeguards in place, measurements in place. And I try to highlight a few of these, but I think what is really interesting to know is that there's a few of these that are really, really bad, right? Supply chain, we talked about that this morning. All right, industrial security, okay? It has not really increased much. It's still at the bottom of the control sets for all of the defense industrial base. And then, interestingly enough, we're talking about production capacity, right? So COVID came along in 2019 and 2020 and really disrupted the supply chain, right? And now we're starting to see with this kind of these conflicts, surge in demand for what the defense industrial base can produce. The problem is that the supply cannot meet the demand. It's actually trending in a negative direction, and that's a problem. That's a problem for our national security. And by the way, these slides will be made available to you, after the conference. So feel free to take notes or pictures if you like, but they will be made available to you. So there was a huge concern when this came back to the DoD. They had already introduced CMMC version 1.0, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then they had these assessments that are saying it's not working. Plus they had opened up for public comment. What do you think? What can we do to improve this? Help us, collaborate with us to make this a better program for managing the information we're sharing with you. They had nearly 900 comments in a short period of time. And so somewhere around March of last year, the DoD said, we got a problem. We got a major problem. We're getting failing grades. We can't meet demand. We can't control the supply issues that we're seeing. I mean, we all know about the container ships and everything else sitting, off the coast of California, trying to get those things in. That's impacting also the supply chain for the DIB. And so they decided we've got to take a halt. We need to kind of look at this. Some of the things that they were concerned about was the cost effectiveness of the program. And this is the federal government for you and the DoD. The Department of Defense is no different. They assumed when the federal acquisition regulation came out that had some of these basic controls in it that organizations would just automatically adopt them and start implementing right away. And then when they had the DFARS, the supplemental regulation, come out on top of FARS, that, hey, they're just going to follow along and add these into. So when CMC came along, they were like, well, this shouldn't be very cost prohibitive. They've already done everything else. They're just doing some additive controls. But as we just discussed a few minutes ago, they didn't do any of them, right? Now, maybe some of the major primes did because they were a little bit closer to, you know, the DoD, and they were probably having a little bit of some audits going on, but not as it pushed down to the smaller manufacturing firms, right? The subprimes, the contracted firms. They weren't doing any of this. So CMC comes out and says, hey, well, version 1.0, you're going to, because you're handling control and classified information, you got 130 controls you have to adhere to. And they looked at this and they went, what? This is millions of dollars. This is time we don't have. This is taken away from our production capacity, hence getting back to this supply chain issue. If we're focused on trying to meet these controls, we can't focus on delivering the products and services that you need. So the DoD recognized we got a major problem. And so with the CMMC AB and organizations like ours and others, we started providing some feedback and said, look, we've got to make some changes. So let's just talk about, first of all, so we have a contextual understanding of what CMMC 1.0 looks like. I've already shared with you that the clauses for FARS and DFARS, the Inspector General report, and the NDIA report that shows the health of the defense industrial base is failing. 2.0 came out in November of last year. It supersedes 1.0. Again, it was a collaborative partnership, and the intent is to enhance the security and the controls of both FCI and CUI. So let's talk about FCI and CUI. FCI is just simply contract information. That's it. Okay? It's basically, I'm going to enter into a contract with you. These are the terms. Here are the delivery times, the scope, everything that's in it. In and of itself, not necessarily national security sensitive information. However, you could garner enough information from the contract and doing research on that particular manufacturing company to understand what they're actually building, what they're doing. And they said, okay, we need to protect this information, right? It's not something everyone should see. It's not meant for disclosure to the public. So there must be some measure of controls on this. The second category of information we're going to focus on is CUI. Controlled and classified information covers a broad range of topics, things from legal, okay, and obviously stuff within the Department of Defense, and specifically where it touched my world is unclassified Navy nuclear propulsion information, all right, NNPI. NNPI is something that is regulated by the Department of Energy and the Department of Navy. And that type of information is readily shared with a lot of manufacturing firms. So there's many different categories, right? And what they were trying to do is say, look, as we list these categories and the types of information, can we determine where we're generating this information? Who are we sharing this information to? Why are we sharing this information? Has it been authorized? And then, has it been protected, and can we continuously monitor to make sure that those protective controls are in place? So that is now the focus of what 2.0 is all about. They decided to simplify the rule, they decided to simplify the process and the regulation with the intent of trying to make it more appetizing to the defense industrial base to adopt. Hopefully, it's also supposed to be less expensive. Now, with any kind of federal rulemaking process, unfortunately, as they continue to add more and more lawmakers into the process, it gets more complex, not less so. We know this. And so that's where the CMMCAB and other organizations like ours are trying to stay engaged in providing constant feedback, saying this is not effective. We're able to use the customer base that we service for CMMC to actually provide back real-time information. This is how it's impacting these businesses. This is what this means. And if you really want to be effective, here's where you need to kind of step up your game and kind of help them, incentivize them, provide them some guidance and direction on how to do this. So these are the two categories of information that CMMC addresses. So let's talk about 1.0 for a minute. 1.0 had
a question.
I'm sorry, were there questions? Yes.
Yeah, it might be a dumb question.
No dumb
I know
questions.
this, But
No.
I'm going to ask why is there unclassified information and why would it remain unclassified?
Again, it's meant for government or DoD work only. It's unclassified in the sense that it doesn't raise up to like confidential, secret, top secret, compartmentalized, but it's still not intended for public release.
Right.
Therefore, it has a sensitivity around it that says, look, the average American doesn't need to know this information, right? They're not going to protect it on their home PC if we just put this on a website. So they really want to protect this information, right? And as we all know, that you could have a bunch of information that, if put together, could rise up where it now needs to be classified.
Yeah.
Good morning. Come on in. Yeah. No, do not apologize. So 1.0 said, look, we recognize that these organizations have not been following FAR. They have not been following DFAR's rules. There's been no behavioral changes in the organizations whatsoever. Therefore, they're not working toward protecting this data. So they came up with two classifications, right? We got practice, we got maturity. We came up with these 5 levels. And what this was intended to do was, based upon the type of information the DoD shared with you. Remember, I talked about the CUI categories, the different types. So for example, if you were handling Navy nuclear propulsion information, you're going to fall up here, right? Because that is considered national security type of information. And even though we may share bits and pieces of it that is CUI, comprised together could harm our Navy and our defense. Contract information, depending on what you were doing, technical information, defense information, level 3, level 4. And essentially, it was going to come up. It was going to be determined from the Department of Defense through the primes what levels you were going to be at. Now let's talk about the difference between a practice and a maturity, because there's a level 3, for example, you see 130 practices, but if you go to the NIST 800-171, there's only 110. So what are the additional 20 that came up to make the 130? Well, those are the maturity processes, and that was based off of. Who's familiar with CMMI? Okay, you guys know what that stands for, right? It's a maturity model, right? In integration. It's to say, I want to look at a control that you're saying, check my box, I'm compliant with, and I want to see how effective that control has actually been implemented. I could say I have an access control policy, but do I actually follow it? Do I actually do like user reviews? Do I distinguish between a privileged user and a non-privileged user? How do I manage those? How do I authorize those? How frequently do I review them? How do I grant them access to certain systems based on these privilege or need to know? That is a maturity process, right? And so they started using the CMMI, which was kind of a collaboration between the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute, the DoD, the federal government, et cetera. And they said, help us determine how do we measure a maturity of a process. And so they came up with these areas, so you can just picture it this way. Is it ad hoc? Meaning I just do it. I don't know that I've documented it. It's up in my head. It's tribal knowledge. I don't really have it written down. I don't really train anyone. I just do it. Okay, well, that's not really a mature process, right? They want to see you get to a point where it's a documented process. People are trained on that process. There's feedback coming from that process to help you improve it, make it better, to ultimately get to optimization. This control is running at its best and most secure, most compliant state. That was the intent, to change organizational behavior, because this wasn't being done. Problem is, companies still weren't doing it, right? They didn't understand it, first of all. Go to a manufacturing firm and find a chief information security officer. Rare, very rare back in the day. Things have changed, but when this first came out, it didn't exist. IT, what was IT focused on? Maintaining the systems, the control systems that were helping the manufacturing processes, right? Made sense. This is where I'm generating my profit, my revenue. This is how I continue to grow my business. Not doing this. And they didn't know what compliance meant. They didn't have compliance officers. So a lot of this was brand new and organizations were just struggling to adopt it. So this is 1.0. Any questions on this? Yes.
Just to be clear, for example, level 5, you have 171.
Yes.
That is when you say 171, that's 171 security controls based off NIST 800-171, correct?
And additional, that could be from industry, that could be part of the maturity processes we discussed. So some of these, you could not point back to an authoritative source like the NIST document and say, well, that's a control that I understand. There's some supplemental guidance. Here's how they're going to examine it to make sure I'm compliant. So it became very difficult to implement because these additional controls, they were coming from many different places and folks just didn't understand how to implement them. Okay. Any other questions on that? Make sense? Yes.
Yeah, I got a dumb question. Probably.
No dumb questions.
Why is level 4 no assessment, but level 3 and level 1 have third-party assessments?
Well, that's a great question, right? And that was part of the challenge was, wait a minute, what constitutes the difference between what is considered a level 3 that requires an assessment all the way to advanced types of threat protection at level 5? Level 4 just didn't seem to fit. And there was no clear indication to answer your question, right? There was a lot of speculation. Well, it's this type of information, and we assume if you're already at level 3 and you've been certified, because each one of these built, you already were certified at level 3. Therefore, the additional controls you're doing at level 4, we're not necessarily concerned about. But when you cross back up to level 5, guess what? Now we're back on you. Because you were always going to have to, at the minimal level, still be assessed, right? Still had to attest that I'm meeting these controls.
Wasn't the intent though that like 80% is going to be at level 1 and only a very small handful is going to be at level
That was the
5?
initial thought.
Right.
And then they started looking at the data they were sending out because they had to actually poll their organizations. Who are you working with? What type of data are you sharing with them? What are they doing for you? DoD at the highest level had no clue. They were trusting, because it was pushed down to the lowest levels, work the process, work it through the normal channels. And then when they started finding out the different types of data based on these levels, they started asking questions going, wait, you're sharing what? What? What are you giving him? And we don't have anything to measure? All right, we got a problem. So along comes level 2. Simplify. We're going to eliminate 2 levels. We're also going to eliminate maturity processes. We are just going to focus on making sure that you have the controls in place to protect, safeguard the information, make sure it's disseminated and shared with only those who are authorized to do so. And so you can see, this slide already is now going to be outdated probably within a week because some changes were announced about 10 days ago. So I'm glad to share some of these with you. Level 2 was the former level 3 in 1.0. And initially, you see here this bifurcation that's taking place. So the DoD, when they said back in November, hey, we're going to simplify all this, we're going to just create 3 levels, we're going to get rid of maturity, but you're going to have to meet these practices. Oh, by the way, the additional controls are gone. It's just based on the NIST 800-171 for the first 2 levels. They said, okay, but level 2 is going to have bifurcation, which means we're going to determine which data we deem to be kind of nationally sensitive. And those folks then would have to have this triannual third-party assessment. Otherwise, these guys were much like level 1. They were going to do an annual self-attestation, self-assessment, have a senior officer in the company sign off on it, and that was good enough. As of 10 days ago, about 10 days ago, the announcement came out that the DoD has said, we're going away with bifurcation. And you know why? They have no way of determining what is nationally sensitive, what isn't. They just don't. So it was good news for companies like ours that are trying to be assessment organizations. That just means there's more, organizations seeking compliance that we can go after as customers. That was good because this was bad news for us, right? If 2/3 of level 2 is going to be able to self-attest, then we can't go help them. But now the DoD has said, hey, no, it's gone away. So from this point, we're back in our game, which is helpful for us to assist people to get compliant. We'll talk about scoping and these assessments here, but I just want to share with you one unique thing. Level 3 has introduced a supplemental NIST guidance, 800-172, and that is very, very specific to advanced persistent threats. So if you think about the analogy I gave earlier in the Pacific Rim, going by a Chinese vessel that looks a lot like the one I'm sitting on, That's the reason why. How is our information being attacked? How is it being extracted? And where is it going to? We know the Chinese, the Russians, and I won't say some of the other groups, I gotta be careful what I say. They're actually within these networks using APTs, okay? And it's easy to see why, because if we're only talking about what we used to call the NIPR, the NIPR net, which is the unclassified networks, those controls, they were being managed by contractors like HP and then other companies who bought or paid for or were the best bidder to manage those networks. Well, they weren't following these controls any more than the rest of the organizations. And so our networks have been hacked multiple times. It's all public record. You can go out, for example, look at China Rose, right? Do a Google search on that if you want to understand how it hit our industrial sector. Lots of these types of attacks are taking place. So they want to focus on that. Are you really protecting your information by doing some of the things like the gentleman that spoke this morning, right? With the kind of the advanced detection and response capabilities. Are you doing those types of things to look for APTs? Things that you don't detect with your normal antivirus and malware, right? It's sitting in resident memory, but it's not really doing anything unless you're threat hunting every single day that you would detect. So that's the one big change is right there. Any questions? Yes.
Level 2, is this slide saying that practices are aligned with 800-171?
Yes.
That you're at level 2, that you are also FedRAMP potentially prepared?
No.
Okay.
Reciprocity with other, that's a great question. Thank you for bringing it up. Reciprocity with other federal regulations is still being discussed. Right. For example, a lot of folks might be operating in the cloud, right? And they might be at a FedRAMP moderate in the cloud. And so we were debating for the longest time that that's more than sufficient for CUI. Unless you're handling certain types of information where you might have to do an overlay on top of it, right? But for the most part, if you went to like government clouds for Google or Microsoft or AWS, and they were FedRAMP certified at the infrastructure and the platform layer, and you're simply dropping your application on top, you would then apply your controls to your application because you're inheriting, first of all, the FedRAMP moderate through the infrastructure and platform, and you just need to make sure your application is at the same level, right? So you work with whoever your federal government agency or DoD agency is to help you get to that point to make sure that they agree, right? So we can get into all the weeds, but if you've ever heard of an SSP, System Security Plan, that's what you're working in, okay? A POAM, Plan of Action and Milestones that list your deficiencies and how you're going to address them, that's what you're working in, okay? These are big ticket items, and let me tell you, most of the manufacturing firms we're working with have no clue what those are, right? Yes?
Does level 2 allow POAM now?
I'm sorry?
Do they allow POAM in level 2?
It's required, right? It's pretty much an expectation.
Level 3 on 1.0, POAM wasn't allowed.
Yeah.
So now,
I know what you're asking now. So here's the thing. They were looking at level 1 and saying, if I was doing level 1, and it's only 17 controls, but I don't have them all in place and they're in my POAM, would my POAM be acceptable to be able to do work on behalf of the DoD for a period of time? Okay. A POAM was always required to show your deficiencies and how you're managing it. That's the governance piece of the 171. But whether a POAM would be acceptable to the DoD to say, yes, I'll still award you a contract, that's still under debate. They're still discussing it. Initially, they said, yes, in certain cases, we'll accept a POAM. And we might even let you have 180 days to get those items completed, and then we'll come back out and make sure those are addressed. So at level 2, same thing, right? That has not been finalized. So we're still waiting to hear, are they going to accept a POAM? My internal gut says maybe at level 1, but not at level 2, right? They're going to want you, they may give you 45 days after they assess you to fix them, because nobody's going to be perfect as you go through and get a C3 PAO to come out and audit you. They're going to find things, and you're going to have a certain amount of time to fix it. Yes?
So this is, well, 2 questions for me. One, just went right on my head. I apologize.
If it comes back, let me know.
Yeah.
All right, let's get to the next one. So,
Oh, I'm sorry, that's what it was. Point of clarity. So right now, 2.0 has not been officially approved.
not been
Are we
adjudicated.
required to abide by 1.0?
No,
We all sort of
Nope.
in a limbo waiting state.
no, that is a fantastic question. Here's the thing. The DoD is going to have no sympathy for anyone at this point who is not going towards 2.0, right? So you know that they've got this. Have you seen the SPRS, the Supplier Performance Risk System, right? This is how you get registered as a defense industrial base customer so that the DoD knows who you are, what you do, and there's an initial score that gets submitted. You have to do something, it's a self-assessment, and you submit that after you register into the SPRS system. And that basically gives the DoD an idea, where are you right now? This is my initial baseline, right?
So I've heard that SPRS is sort of not really taken up very seriously because it's essentially a tool to make organizations who are not familiar with security them aware that they have to be familiar with security. Right?
They'll care about it when they start implementing the fact that, hey, look, my SPRS and my scores, right? So we're talking about a system of record here that the DoD uses to identify ones they can do business with. Now, what there's still debate, and I really don't want to go down this trail, but I'll just mention it briefly, is those of us that are auditing firms, are we going to have to use like EMAS, this monolithic, ugly system to upload all the data so that, you know, your company's record is completely in there? I pray to God we don't have to, right? That would just kill this program. We want to be quick and be able to move forward.
I will say that the SPRS score is important to have if you're going to bid on any contract.
Absolutely.
Today, just to have it in there.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
So to that, so that's an annual thing, we haven't done it again this year. Have they changed it, or are they still using their DoD assessment methodology in the SPRS, or have they updated it?
Have not updated.
So it's the same as last year?
Yeah. So what we heard about 10 days ago in the last AD meeting, they had just come back, was speaking with the CISO and the CIO from the DoD. And you know how in November, they said, hey, this rule could take anywhere from 9 to 36 months to adjudicate. They're much, much closer to adjudicating. So rumor intelligence, as they said in the Navy, which is just really cooler talk, right? It's just, hey, did you hear? They're talking about next summer, right? And so there's some incentives they're running to push out right away. The fact that they're spinning up the engine again to get companies certified means they're getting ready to send companies out to go start, getting companies attested as assessment organizations. They're ready to send you out to go certify other companies. So the DoD is, I don't think they're long. I think next summer is probably realistic. And you're going to start seeing this happening really quick. And so, just a second, to his working toward it, and our organization seeking compliance and saying, hey, I'm ready, those are the ones that are going to get those contracts first, right? So it's a race to revenue, if you will. Yes.
Are you guys still, they still plan to do the higher levels first and work their way down, like they did the 1.0?
Have not heard if they're going to do that. Okay. There's so much, and maybe we'll save some of these as we get to the end about SPRS, because I do want to get through some of this information, and unfortunately it's 9:44. And so if you guys don't mind, so I think we kind of talked about the 3 levels, the maturity processes have gone away. So let's talk about scoping, because scoping to me is critical. All right, so I'm just going to combine level 1 and level 2 together so we can talk about it. What organizations need to be doing right now, whether they're an SPRS or not, is determine what systems are actually housing this type of data, right? It could be your back office systems that are doing the contract information. Who's touching it? Where is it stored? Do we send it anywhere else? Those systems are now in scope, and they should be part of your level 1 assessment. And you should be thinking about, do I have those 17 practices from NIST 800-171 applied where I can demonstrate a policy, a procedure, and evidence that the procedure is working against those systems, those people that are using it, and those, by the way, security personnel or IT personnel who support the system. They're in scope too. If you're using a managed IT service provider, they're in scope. If you're using outside security tools that also support the rest of your business, like firewalls, antivirus, a SIM for monitoring audit logs, they're now in scope too. So you have to think carefully, how do I build this picture that when an auditor comes in, that I can clearly define where it comes in, how it transits, where it's stored, where it's processed, and where it's disposed of, meeting these controls. And everyone that's associated with it. Because that's exactly the test cases, which is part of the NIST 800-171 Alpha, the A version of it, gives you all the test cases. It's going to show you exactly, if they come in and interview, what they're going to be looking for. If they come in to examine, to actually go through the documents, what they're going to be looking for. And then God forbid, the next step, if they're going to test. They want to see that control in action, how they're going to do it. So that really is what organizations should be focused on if they feel like we're compliant. I need to go look at the test cases. Am I really ready to go, right? That's going to be your what we call your watermark level, saying, yeah, I'm ready. I'm ready for this. Okay. Because it's not a self-assessment. It's an independent organization that's been accredited by the DoD to come out and look at you. It's going to go deeper. And it only makes sense, right? You're handling a much more higher level of sensitive information. And then when you get to level 3, it's game over. The DIBCAC, right? The Cybersecurity Assessment Center is coming out to audit you, or some other federal government agency. Because at that point, they're really going to start doing the testing, not just interviews. They're going to examine and test. And they want to make sure that your advanced persistent threat prevention and technologies and detections are in place and are working effectively. Again, you'll get these slides afterwards, but it's, interesting is when you think of all the different categories, what applies and what doesn't apply. The two that I will call out as unique are going to be the contractor risk managed type of assets. Those are your third party, like an IT managed service provider, or a contractor who's working on your behalf that's getting into your environment. They may be like in a VDI, virtual desktop environment, in its view only, right? So the virtual desktop environment's in scope, but the contractor, because he's not really storing any of that information, he's not taking any of that information, he's not part of the assessment, and their system's not part of the assessment, but you have to list it in your controls and your information, kind of your asset inventory, if you will. Same thing for specialized assets. And those are things that they don't necessarily process, store, or transmit CUI, but help support your environment. Okay, could be a manufacturing line, et cetera. Any questions on that before we move on? Okay. Scope reduction. Scope reduction is important. First thing we tell any organization is to identify your data flow, right? That is key. Where is this data coming from? Who's your prime contractor? Or if you're working with the DoD directly, who is the people that you're working with and the systems that they send information from? And then start tracing that through your organization. That's the first thing. Get an idea of what that looks like. And then start tacking in the people that are using these systems, the people that are supporting the systems, and the other systems outside of this that are being used for like either special assets or security assets. That will help. And then you need to understand your data type. Am I federal contract information only, or do I actually handle CUI? Because that means a difference in the number of controls, the type of controls, and the cost of implementation and continuous monitoring of those controls. One of the ways you can reduce scope is, you know what, hey, I have both. I get contract information, I get technical information. The DoD will often send me specific information regarding a program that falls outside of either one of those, but is still CUI. Do I have to have separate environments? Maybe. Might make sense. Maybe my back office systems are just for my contracts, so I can do the self-assessment there. I don't have to pull them into the much larger, level 2 with 110 controls. I can just do 17. And maybe then I separate out the rest of this and I go after level 2 and I can control my costs. But that adds management overhead, right? You've got to be able to clearly distinguish and explain to someone like me how that has been logically and physically separated, that they don't touch. There's no intermingling, right? So that I can actually say, okay, I agree with your scope. I'm going to assess this for level 1, or actually you will, and I'll assess this for level 2, okay? It's up to you guys. That's the best part. The DoD says you guys can make the decision based on what's best for your business from a level of effort standpoint and from a cost standpoint. And I think that's important. Okay, this is the important part that I really wanted to get to. Okay, so once you've assessed the actual information and you've gotten the data flow, the people, the processes, the technology, and you have it mapped, that is now your authorization boundary. As I mentioned earlier, you can use the NIST 800-171 alpha version for each and every one of the controls and go through and basically say, is it met? Have I met that control to the letter of the law that they're looking for? Maybe it's not met. Maybe I'm close, but I don't have everything. Well, what's going to end up happening is that gap from not met to met goes into your POAM. Okay? That's going to be a deficiency that you have to address and make sure it's addressed before you get audited. That's going to help you as a management team to look and say, how much work do we have left to do? What's my timing before I can say I'm ready for an audit? What are my associated costs? Who's responsible? And then who's governing all of this? What do I mean by governing it? How do I take that information and get it back to the control that I'm supposed to follow? And how am I managing all of that? Now, back in the day when I worked with Dave and Robin, and I won't say the company name, I don't think we're allowed to. I'm not sure. Are we allowed? Is that right? You don't get it. All right.
They're no longer around.
Well, that's true. I'm not. When we were at Standard Register and we had to do FSMA work, you know, we were using SharePoint, network, drives, just, you know, multiple spreadsheets. You want to talk about overhead and governance. We had a team of 3 and we still didn't feel like it was enough, did it? Not even close. And we were all dividing and conquering. And that's not even going through and auditing our own controls and making sure the environment was built and all the manufacturing processes were, you know, tightly done. And then, I mean, it was a mess. I don't know how organizations do it today without using some form of automation, data-driven automation, like a GRC suite, right? That's really what you're focusing on here. And then it makes it easier to be able to demonstrate your management control back to the auditor. So once you've defined all of these things and you know that you're safeguarding and you've passed the alpha tests and you've gathered all of your artifacts and evidence, you're now ready. Recommendation that I would make: go to one of these C3PAO organizations, ask for a pre-audit assessment. Don't pay for the actual assessment that's going to get recorded and uploaded to the DoD. Now, why would I do that? Why would I do a pre-assessment? Well, what if I'm not ready? What if I fail and that gets reported outward? I'm now heading towards the back of the list before I can retest again. Okay, other organizations. And again, remember, we're talking about speed to market, speed to revenue, right? I want to get these contracts. So if I do a pre-assessment and I can see that I've got a few gaps and they go into a POAM from a company who actually audits, you know that when you fix those and they say, hey, you're good to go, now you can go do the audit. That makes sense. Yes, it costs a little more, but it's worth it. It is absolutely worth it to make sure you haven't missed anything. One thing I failed to mention earlier I want to bring up. DoD is looking to incentivize organizations. When they first said that, we were like, what? They're going to do cash payouts? Come on. We all know that's not true, right? That goes through a whole nother process to get awarded and issued. No way. So what do they mean by incentivize? Here's what we've heard. And actually, this is great news. Let's say you're level 2 or level 3 under 2.0. What they're going to do is if you're willing to go get certified now, like when they start releasing this summer, I believe, it's going to be June, July, August, they're going to start sending these C3PAOs out to do this certification process. And I know we're getting close on time. Thank you. What's going to happen is let's say you get certified. Well, you're supposed to get a triannual assessment. So in 3 years, you do it again. But the rule hasn't been finalized yet. So how can they do that? Well, what they're going to do is they're going to say, guess what? You get another year. So that's the benefit. Yours is 4 years out now instead of 3 years out. They're going to give you an extra year. That's fantastic. There's some savings there because these audits, they're not cheap. Okay? Have an organization, because what they're talking about now is that none of your information can leave your environment during the audit. Well, that just means I have to go on site. I have to do all of my auditing right then and there. I have to store all of your information. I have to hash your information. There's a lot of steps and processes I have to do to say the evidences that I certified you with are still there and untouchable and nobody else can get to them, but that's expense. You think about sending 2 or 3 auditors out to your site for a couple of weeks. Yes.
Okay, so just to be clear, what you're saying is, as the audit's going on, because it's essentially a snapshot in time, there has to be a work stoppage?
No. This is where your GRC automation tool comes in. One thing we envisioned, we all talked about was like, man, it would be a great way just to create a view for an auditor, right? All the work's already been done. They come in to audit. Here, sit down, go through this. Come talk to me if you got a question, right? GRC automation tools have done that. That's what we do, right? We are a cybersecurity software company, and we have built a GRC platform for that very reason. We use, people call it artificial intelligence. It's really machine learning language, right? We call it a natural language processor that maps all of this back to the actual controls, pulls in your data-driven, reports from the various tools and systems and creates that view for the auditor. That's what you're looking for. Because at that point, when they come in, they can see the SSP and they can read it. I don't have to be sitting right by them to do that, right? I can see the point. I can see if there are any deficiencies. I can see all the artifacts and evidences. I have my examiner's tools right there. I'm just typing up my report, right, as I'm watching this. And then whatever data is shared with me stays on their network. And again, I have to hash it. And then I provide the key back to, upwards and upwards to the reporting agencies and say, good, they're good to go. Yes.
Also, to something you just said, mentioning the expense, to clarify, there is no current reciprocity between CMMC at any of the levels and let's say 800, 171, or anything as far as
171 is part of CMMC. That is the foundation of CMMC. But if you're talking like FedRAMP, I believe the answer is going to be yes. That if you went to a cloud environment that is FedRAMP moderate across the board for confidentiality, integrity, and availability, they're going to say yes. Reciprocity will mean. Why? Because those controls, they're from the 853 and they're pretty extensive, right? They're going to cover everything. There might be a few deltas between the two that you might have to cover. That's it, right? Some things we've learned, and Jay, this is really where I want you to chime in. I don't know if you can see the screen or not, but we've worked with a lot of organizations that have started with 1.0, transitioned into 2.0. They're now going, I just want an SPRS score. That's all I want. I just want to get in the system. Because they think they've got 36 months to implement this. It's not going to happen. What are some of the challenges we've seen from organizations, how it's impacting their business? They're not ready from a tech perspective, especially smaller organizations and medium organizations. They have not gone and looked at the controls and the requirements of the 171 to see the technical controls that have to be in place. One of the big ones that most organizations fail from a manufacturing perspective is logging and monitoring. And then incident management, incident detection, incident response as a result of logging and monitoring. They have no way to centralize, normalize these log files, aggregate them and correlate them into something that they can look at and go, we got a problem. Let's go address it. That's not an inexpensive solution to go implement. Requires thought, requires training. Also, when we talked about reducing your scope, that might require that I re-architect my network. I might need to add a few pieces of hardware in there so I can create some VLANs, right? I can actually demonstrate that the flow of information is secure, it doesn't cross over into the rest of my production network. There's a lot of things from a technology perspective many organizations fail to account for, and I've just named a few. A lot of them don't even have firewalls. And that would shock you, right? We talked about, or he talked about in the presentation this morning, multi-factor authentication, right? Remote access. A lot of organizations have remote access with no controls. How am I doing? Am I close? How much more time do I have?
30 seconds.
Okay, questions? Sorry, it's been good. Any questions? And I'll stay outside afterwards. Jay and I will, if you've got some additional questions. Well, I hope that's been helpful, guys. Thank you for coming this morning. Appreciate it. Appreciate your time. I'm glad I asked you when I did. Otherwise, we were going to
I know when I show a project what I do.
Can I take it outside?
If you're interested in the code, it's 3391. That's the code. So,
I hope they win. Well, not all day.
Now I think they've got it. Networking.
Basically break time.
So I hope my email to SDS makes sense, and your email as well. You know, just try to explain to them, like, we now know what the schedule looks like for testing. So when we said, yeah, next week might be okay, now it doesn't look so okay. Just kind of explaining it to me, the list was like, well, why? You said it didn't have to be done this week. I said, well, yeah, but you really want to risk it?